On May 8, 2025, the Vatican II sect chose Robert Prevost as their new antipope. He took the name Leo XIV. He's not Catholic, and he's definitely not the Pope. This is certain, as this video will prove. He's another non-Catholic antipope of the Vatican II sect, the prophesied end times counterchurch. As we've pointed out previously, none of the Vatican II sect's so-called cardinals were eligible to be elected as pope because they are all notorious heretics. They all accept the heresies of Vatican II, false ecumenism, and much more. Heretics are not members of the Catholic Church, hence they are barred by divine law from the Supreme Pontificate. That's Catholic teaching. Robert Prevost, aka Antipope Leo, is without question a notorious heretic. This is easily proven. First, consider his predecessor in the Vatican II Church, Antipope Francis, and then consider Prevost's open communion and public alignment with him. As head of the dicastery of bishops, Prevost oversaw the selection of most new bishops in the Vatican II sect. That means that Prevost worked closely with Antipope Francis.
I meet with the Holy Father frequently, during most of the year, at least once a week.
If you understand Catholic principles, you know that people who profess communion with undeniable notorious heretics, such as with Arians, the Monophysite Peter Mongoose, etc., were considered by that fact to be heretics and not part of the Catholic Church.
And I have to say, Pope Francis is an incredible guy to work with and for.
This is very important to understand even before one gets into the considerable specific evidence against Prevost, aka Antipope Leo. For example, in condemning communion with heretics, Pope St. Gelasius, who was referring to Acacius, taught, quote, "He implicated himself in another man's crime through his communion with him," end quote. Notice, the mere profession of communion with a notorious heretic makes that person a heretic and guilty. Gelasius makes the same point repeatedly in his letters because it's a Catholic principle. In letter 27 he says, quote, "All accomplices, followers, and those in communion with a crookedness that has been condemned once and for all are adjudged to a matching fate," end quote. Was Francis a notorious heretic? Yes, without any question. He was one of the most notorious heretics in all of church history. To deny that is just to blaspheme God. Here's a short section from our previous video that quickly summarizes Francis's heresies. Francis taught that every religion is a way to arrive at God.
Tutte le religioni sono un cammino per arrivare a Dio.
Because every religion is a way to arrive at God.
Qualcuno è Sikh, qualcuno musulmano, qualcuno hindi, qualcuno cristiano, ma sono diversi cammini.
There are different paths.
That by itself proves that he was a monumental apostate, thoroughly wicked, and not Catholic. But Francis taught so many other heresies. In addition to promoting complete religious indifferentism on a regular basis, he participated in non-Catholic and pagan worship, including in a Buddhist prayer, in a prayer to the, quote, sacred circle of spirits, and more. He endorsed gross immorality and elevated those who promote it. He formally approved, quote, blessing so-called couples who live in adultery, fornication, and sodomy. He didn't condemn the most notorious supporters of abortion and the, quote, LGBT agenda, but instead encouraged them. He condemned the death penalty, explicitly agreed with Martin Luther on justification, and promoted modernism in various ways.
Io credo che le intenzioni di Martin Lutero non erano sbagliate. E oggi luterani e cattolici, protestanti tutti, siamo d'accordo sulla dottrina della giustificazione. Su questo punto tanto importante lui non aveva sbagliato.
We could go on as we do in our videos and articles. He taught the heresy that all the baptized are in the Church of Christ. On many occasions, he taught that it's illicit to convince people of the faith and much more. It's all documented, these are all facts, despite what certain wicked liars will falsely claim to their condemnation. Francis was not remotely Catholic.
O Espíritu Santo, ayúdanos a reconocer con gozo los dones que han venido a la Iglesia por la Reforma.
Prevost was a close collaborator with the Protestant and notorious heretic Antipope Francis. Not only that, Prevost left no doubt about his theological and spiritual alignment with the Protestant Antipope Francis by praising and thanking Francis in his opening speech after his false election. In his opening speech, he stated, quote, "Let us keep in our ears the weak but always brave voice of Pope Francis, who blessed Rome," end quote. He also said, quote, "Thank you, Pope Francis," end quote.
Ancora conserviamo nei nostri orecchi quella voce debole ma sempre coraggiosa di Papa Francesco che benediva Roma. Grazie a Papa Francesco.
In a speech on May 10th, 2 days after his false election, Prevost aligned himself with Francis no fewer than 4 times.
Santo Padre Francesco.
Let me give you an analogy. Suppose a notorious Arian heretic died and was replaced by one of his close collaborators, and in his opening speech the new person voiced his support for and communion with his Arian predecessor. Would that person likewise be considered an Arian heretic? Yes, of course, and Catholics would have an obligation to reject that person. In fact, no Catholic has any authority to regard such a person as a Catholic. The very same principle applies to Prevost as a result of his communion with Francis. By his public alignment and communion with the notorious non-Catholic anti-Pope Francis, without even considering anything else Prevost says, he is proven to be a notorious heretic like Francis and ineligible for the papacy. That's the key point. So it's really very simple. If you consider Francis to have been a heretic, then you must reject Prevost. And if you don't consider Francis to have been a heretic, well, you are an apostate. Here's Prevost paying homage and praying at the tomb of anti-Pope Francis. St. Thomas taught that if anyone were to pay homage at the tomb of Muhammad, he would be deemed an apostate. Likewise, someone who pays homage or praise at the tomb of anti-Pope Francis is deemed a heretic. But Prevost has taught many heresies himself, and he will undoubtedly promote many more as time goes along. His false election was endorsed by the notorious, quote, LGBT supporter James Martin, who called it brilliant and said that he rejoices in it.
Hey everyone, it's Jim Martin, and just sort of stunned by the news of the election of Pope Leo XIV, former Cardinal Prevost. I got to know him a little bit at the Synod. He was at my table, and I know him to be a down-to-earth, kind, modest, reserved guy, hardworking, decisive, not afraid of speaking his mind. It's a great choice. I rejoice in this election of Pope Leo XIV.
As head of the dicastery of, quote, bishops, Prevost elevated the notorious Robert McElroy to Washington, D.C. Here's a clip from an individual in the Vatican II sect lamenting the choice of Prevost.
Not only that, we found out that during COVID, he not only locked down the churches, but he also insisted on communion at hand. And then get this, invalid confessions. He wanted to do them over the phone, which does not count, by the way. So we're wondering if we're even dealing with a Catholic. This gets real strange. So you've got an anti-Trump Pope who is an American. So maybe that makes him a Biden Pope. I don't even know. Well, not only that, you have this is the very head of the Congregation of Bishops who presided over getting rid of America's Bishop Joseph Strickland and the elevation of Cardinal McElroy, the worst bishop in America, to be the Archbishop of Washington, D.C.
We have a video on the radical apostate Robert McElroy on our website. Prevost's communion with such an apostate further demonstrates that they are in a false church. Before his false election, Prevost came out against the death penalty, reposted things that manifest religious indifferentism, and more. In his speech on May 10th, one of his very first as antipope, Prevost endorsed the notoriously heretical document called Evangelii Gaudium, published by antipope Francis in 2013. He called it masterful.
Papa Francesco ne ha richiamato e attualizzato magistralmente I contenuti dell'esortazione apostolica Evangelii Gaudium.
That heretical document, Evangelii Gaudium, teaches the heresy that people who live as non-Christians can be justified by the grace of God. That's blatantly heretical and contrary to what the Church has dogmatically defined. namely that only those with the Christian/Catholic faith can be justified, the same document teaches the heresy that Jews have a valid covenant with God, and it misuses Scripture to teach that false doctrine. Hence, within his first few days, Prevost promoted notorious heresies that have been condemned by true popes. Another example of how Prevost simply continues the Vatican II apostasy is found in the Vatican's message to Buddhists dated May 12, a few days after he was, quote, elected. The Committee for Interreligious Dialogue, now operating under Prevost, sent out a horrible and diabolical message, as it typically does, to commemorate the Buddhist feast of Vesak and encourage the pagans in their false religion that does not lead to salvation but damnation. The message amounts to an endorsement of Buddhism, and it's based on Vatican II. It's a manifestation of religious indifferentism. That's what Prevost allows and is in communion with.
And now I'm looking forward to go to Rome to greet the new Pope, to assist at his enthronement.
His first so-called Mass was a Novus Ordo false Mass that featured 2 female readers.
A reading from the book of Revelation. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb.
Para un sacerdocio santo, a fin de ofrecer sacrificios espirituales.
That proves that he's not even liturgically traditional, but even if he were, it wouldn't change the fact that doctrinally he's a notorious heretic. Indeed, on May 8th, the day on which he was chosen by the Vatican II Counterchurch, Prevost sent a letter to the American Jewish Committee assuring them that he would cooperate with them in the, quote, spirit of Vatican II and Nostra Aetate. Not only is Nostra Aetate heretical, but countless heretical and sinful actions and statements by members of the Vatican II sect have been based directly on it, including gravely sinful acts in their places of, quote, worship. Prevost's letter on this matter is more proof that he's not Catholic. In 2023, Prevost also affirmed that he's in agreement with Francis being, quote, open and welcoming to people of whatever lifestyle choice, dress, etc.
Different interpretations of marriage, etc. Have you, given Francis's leadership, experienced any change from 2012 until now?
Given many things that have changed, I would say there's been a development in the sense of the need for the church to open and to be welcoming. And on that level, I think Pope Francis made it very clear that he doesn't want people to be excluded simply on the basis of choices that they make, whether it be lifestyle, work, way to dress, or whatever.
That includes blessing so-called couples who engage in fornication, sodomy, etc. That further proves that Prevost is a pro-quote LGBT apostate. Prevost considers the notoriously heretical anti-popes Paul VI and John Paul II, who both promoted religious indifferentism and false ecumenism, to be saints.
And we needed St. John Paul II. St. John Paul II to the Second Vatican Council and Pope St. Paul VI.
In his May 10th speech, he affirmed his, quote, complete commitment to the path that the Vatican II sect has followed since Vatican II. That path includes regular and notorious heretical participation in ecumenical events that have been condemned by Catholic teaching, as well as joint declarations with heretical sects. Prevost's commitment to Vatican II further proves that he's a Protestant, for Vatican II teaches the heresies that Protestants who reject the papacy are inside the body of Christ, that it's permissible to participate in Protestant worship, that Protestants may receive Holy Communion, that Protestant sects that reject the papacy have saints and martyrs, that Protestant sects are a means of salvation, that Protestant worship is evidence that they have supposedly been justified by grace, and more. Those heresies are condemned by Catholic teaching and constitute terrible theology. In addition to being a notorious heretic, Prevost is also not a valid priest, having been, quote, ordained in the invalid new rite promulgated by anti-Pope Paul VI. That also shows that he's not eligible to be a king of the Vatican City State's sacerdotal monarchy. See our previous video on Francis's legacy for why that's relevant and for a very important summary of how the current situation in Rome was prophesied. It also refutes straw men and lies that people promote about our views on those matters. People also ask about how the chair of Peter could be vacant for this long and how there could be another pope. Those questions are powerfully answered in our video called Did the Bible Predict 70 Years Without a Pope? It is not incompatible with Catholic teaching to have a decades-long vacancy in the chair of St. Peter. Indeed, just as there was a very long vacancy in the throne of David prior to Christ's first coming, and yet the throne of David retained its perpetuity and the promises attached to it, there is a long vacancy in the throne of St. Peter prior to Christ's second coming. The Vatican II sect is the prophesied whore of Babylon, the end times counterchurch, as our videos show. That further indicates that what we're dealing with is a Babylonian captivity, where this counterchurch takes control of the church's physical structures for decades. If you adhere to Prevost, you are adhering to a non-Catholic counterchurch, not the Catholic Church. So it's really simple. Do you determine your position based on the Catholic faith or based on buildings and some externals? That's the issue. If you actually believe in the Catholic faith and profess it, you know that Prevost is heretical, leading a non-Catholic sect, and must be rejected. However, if the determining factor for you is who occupies the Vatican and how many people think he's the Pope, then you will likewise accept him, be deceived, and condemned for denying the Catholic faith. That's the difference, and that's the test of the last days. Do you adhere to the true faith of the Catholic Church, defined by the popes and councils throughout history, or go by externals, buildings, and numbers, even though the sect that has those buildings and numbers is notoriously heretical?
I submit myself to His Holiness, Pope Leo XIV, Supreme Pontiff. And so I bend the knee and I accept Pope Leo XIV, my Holy Father.
I said this in my last video, but something else that I found very encouraging is his willingness to conform himself to certain kinds of traditions, like wearing the papal garb that he wore when he first greeted the crowds in St. Peter's Square. Some of the things we've seen liturgically, where he's just following the script of the rubrics and the missal of the Mass.
The next thing that caught my attention was what he was wearing. He was wearing that red mozzetta, and he was wearing a golden pectoral cross. And then he had that stole that was embroidered in gold. He was wearing what Pope Benedict had wore when he first stepped onto that balcony, and he was wearing what John Paul II wore when he stepped onto that balcony.
Yes, there are multitudes who think that the non-Catholic Prevost is the Pope, and they are all deceived. They are on the wrong path, just like there are multitudes of fools in hell. Further, since Francis was so notoriously non-Catholic, there was no excuse for people who saw some of the evidence against him to not reject him as a heretic and a non-Catholic. It doesn't get any more heretical than his teaching that every religion is a way to arrive at God. That convicted multitudes. The people who didn't condemn him are utter phonies who deny the Catholic faith and are condemned by God. Well, Prevost is notoriously continuing Francis's path. He's publicly in communion with him, as we've shown. Hence, all of those commentators who have accepted Prevost as, quote, Pope right off the bat are proving that they are in a non-Catholic sect, the same sect that Francis led, and they are leading large numbers into heresy and hell. They are phonies and false teachers who have no supernatural faith whatsoever. Those who are adhering to Prevost are in a large Protestant sect that has taken control of the Vatican. They are not in the Catholic Church. God has allowed the buildings to be taken over by anti-popes and a counterchurch, with the true church being reduced to a remnant consisting of those people who actually care about the Catholic faith and adhere to it. The Vatican II sect is not the Catholic Church, it's the prophesied end times counterchurch, and God has allowed this situation to happen in Rome as a punishment for the sins of the people, similar to what he allowed to happen to the Holy City in the Old Testament, as a punishment. To be a true Catholic and be saved, one must be a traditional Catholic, as our material explains.